I'm Lori Ogleski, Director of Wholesale Optimization for Fifth Third Bank Chicago and executive sponsor of our Women's Business Resource Group. On behalf of all of us at Fifth Third Bank, it's a pleasure to welcome you to our brief discussion, Building an Economy that Works for Everyone, following the most recent Road to Recovery Shriver Center event a few weeks back. I'd like to start by thanking women employed for collaborating with us on today's event and for their work and advocacy to support the economic status of women and remove barriers to economic equity. The Shriver Center discussion focused on inequities uncovered by the pandemic in industries such as domestic and warehouse workers. Notably, the panelists discussed the window of opportunity to take advantage of the momentum to shift policies to further support the most vulnerable in our society. Today's debrief will focus on these inequities with an eye towards women in the workplace and actionable steps we can take to support them. As the executive sponsor of our Women's Business Resource Group, and as a woman with passion for the advancement of other women, I am delighted to welcome our guests today, Sharmili Majmudar, Executive Vice President of Policy and Organizational Impact at Women Employed, and Susan Gallagher, President and CEO of the BPI Group, a global organization focused on leadership, talent, and career transition. Both women have careers dedicated to supporting the advancement of women in different fields. I look forward to hearing from Sharmili and Susan, as well as from my colleague, Fifth Third Senior Vice President and Commercial Banker, Jessica Andujar Redman. The global pandemic further amplified the inequities and opportunity gaps that exist for women in the workforce. Yet there is a collective opportunity to make meaningful progress towards eliminating these long-standing inequities in that amplification. So I thank each of you for joining me today and being part of that progress. I know we will have an engaging and thought-provoking discussion. We will leave better informed on the issues and better informed on what we can do in our own lives and within our organizations to bring about positive change. Now let us get started today. I'd like to introduce Jessica Andujar Redman.
Thank you. Thank you, Lori, for that warm welcome, but also for your leadership here at Fifth Third, including serving as the executive sponsor for our Women's Business Resource Group. As Lori mentioned, my name is Jessica Andujar Redman, Senior Vice President here at Fifth Third Bank. I lead a team focused on government and institutional clients. I'll serve as the moderator today for our esteemed panelists, Susan and Sharmili. But before we dive into the discussion today, I just want to cover off on a few housekeeping items. We're going to have time to answer questions towards the end of the conversation. So feel free to drop those questions into the chat. We'll make sure to monitor that and redirect where necessary. But also for the panelists, we're really hoping for it to be a conversation, a very casual conversation. So please feel free to redirect questions back and forth to each other. And I want to also, center on the fact that we're here to amplify the conversation that was held with the Shriver Center. So that conversation, as Lori mentioned, was centered on building an economy for everyone. And of course, that's centered on everyone. And our conversation is going to take a lens on building an economy that works for women in the workforce as well. And our panelists are absolutely qualified to speak to both ends of what that means. So I'm really enthused for the conversation that's ahead of us. And I'd like to kick it off perhaps with a brief introduction. And Sharmili, would you like to kick us off with just a bit about yourself and the organization Women Employed?
Sure. Thank you so much, Jessica, and for introducing us, Lori. We're so happy to be partnering with Fifth Third on this, and I'm glad to be serving on this panel with Susan. The event that Shriver hosted was particularly meaningful, I think, in this moment, and also because we partner with the Shriver Center on advancing a number of the goals that they have focused their mission on. But for those of you who aren't familiar with Women Employed, we're an advocacy organization that has a track record of championing changes that make work for women. we pursue equity for women in the workforce by effecting policy change, by expanding access to educational opportunities, and we advocate for fair and inclusive workplaces so that all women, families, and communities can thrive. We have a new strategic plan, and it focuses on ways to grow women's economic power and to close the wage and wealth gap at the intersection of race and gender. As the Executive Vice President of Policy and Organizational Impact, I have the opportunity to oversee our policy and programs that advance our goals. And that's everything from increasing racial equity in higher education to securing paid leave for all working people in Illinois, to ensuring that women in low-paid jobs have real pathways, not just to jobs, but to quality jobs that offer them and their families economic choices, to also consulting and supporting organizations and forward-thinking companies who really want to make a difference as it relates to gender and racial equity for their workforces. I'm so glad to be here.
Thank you, Sharmili. And Susan, how about yourself? Could you share a little bit about you and BPI Group as well?
Sure, and thank you so much for having me. I think this is such an important dialogue and really important to take important events like the Shriver event, the work that Women Employed does, and amplify it, which is what I think Fifth Third is doing. So thank you. It's fantastic. I lead a company called BPI Group, and we are a global leader in executive coaching, leadership acceleration, and outplacement. And we help people and organizations really discover their own potential. Our approach helps leaders develop capabilities and leadership skills and helps them embrace change. And that leads them strategically forward. It helps achieve growth breakthroughs. And one of our center points is inclusive leadership. We are growing, and the good news is that there are a lot of organizations paying attention to this now. So I hope that the momentum continues, and I think it will, and we look forward to playing a big part in that.
Well, thank you for your work in that. And I know I'm extremely excited again because of the unique perspectives that you're both bringing to the conversation. Susan, with your lens more towards a corporate setting and the leaders that help facilitate the necessary change, it's a really great point of view in the discussion. And then Sharmili, of course, for your work and advocating for all women, but in particular low-wage workers and solving the gaps there. So I have so much to learn from the both of you, and I'm looking forward to, first learning a little bit more about you and your experience. So if you could, I'd love to hear about your personal journey, and perhaps if there's folks that impacted you along the way or made a big impact on your journey professionally, also policy or the lack of policy that impacted your direction. Would just to love to dive into your story a little bit deeper. And Sharmili, if you'd like to go first.
Sure, I'd be happy to. I'm a daughter of immigrants, and my mother was a nurse in India before she immigrated here to the U.S. And although she was a practicing nurse in India when she got here, she was told that she'd have to redo everything from high school onwards in order to have any job in healthcare at all. And she kind of didn't want to go back to high school, understandably. And it really shifted her path forward and was one of the things I think that created our family emphasis on ensuring that we had the education and credentials to be able to actually have choices. And I think that resonates very much with my work at Women Employed. Prior to Women Employed, though, I actually did work in gender-based violence, so in doing domestic violence and sexual assault work. And I have a master's in social work from Loyola, go Ramblers. And I was my work was direct clinical work with survivors of various kinds of trauma, all the way up to executive leadership. And I did that for about 25 years. And throughout the work that I did there, it was just always clear that economic choices shape all sorts of choices, and that having access to good jobs, having access to education that gets you to those good jobs, being able to have enough income, savings, assets to be able to make decisions about where you live, about your economic independence, about what happens for yourself and your family. It was just always a through line with all of the survivors of violence that I worked with. And so it was natural for me to move into the work that Women Employed does, and really focusing on creating those economic choices and ensuring that people have access to those choices. I think that, you know, one of the biggest pieces of advice that I've gotten that was meaningful to me in my career was that it is always important to be able to articulate your impact. No one is going to do it for you. And you can't just rely on the proof of your work to speak for yourself. You really have to be able to speak for yourself as well. That piece of self-advocacy, I think, is particularly critical for women. The policies that have helped me progress in my career are ones I think that sometimes people don't think of. Things like paid sick leave, being able to take time off when I'm not well. And I've had the opportunity to have access to that policy throughout my professional career. And it is not actually something that most workers who are in low paid professions have access to. Employee-driven flexible scheduling, opportunities to represent the organizational externally, to participate in knowledge and skill building like conferences and in other places, being given stretch projects, having access to building retirement benefits. I think those are all policies that I see as having contributed to my career growth, as well as setting me up for my future as well.
Wow, I love the conversation on choices. That's something I think I can see us revisiting throughout the conversation today. Just the ability to get to the point where you're making choices and what provides for that foundation. But thank you so much for sharing your story. I think there's a lot more to drill down on there. But Susan, I'd love to hear more about you and your professional journey as well.
Sure. And Sharmili, you know, I think we could spend the whole hour on some of those points. So very interesting, and I also want to hear more. I also am from immigrants. Almost everybody in America sometimes is, but it was a little further back. But my ancestors helped build the railroads across the northern part of the United States, came from Ireland. The other half came from Germany, and they were farmers. So interesting, my grandfather became a conductor, so stayed in the rail industry for a long time. But anyway, as you shared your background, I thought, oh, that is interesting to think about those ancestors. I was really fortunate. My story goes to, I'll do 40 years in 4 minutes for you. I was really fortunate to learn from and lead at several organizations, both corporate and civic, over the years, which also introduced me to many super interesting people. And the benefit of that was they all saw the world through different lens, right? Through different set of eyes and different set of experiences. And I mention that because I think that was really important and informed my career and led me to where I am today. I grew up kind of doing forensic accounting, which is problem solving with numbers, if you will. Did fraud investigations, messy corporate turnarounds, global tax controversies, and I loved it. I helped build this into a consulting business at Anderson, and then again as one of the founders of Huron Consulting Group. And over the years was recruited to run a couple of different professional services firms that needed a new strategy or a financial turnaround. But that's kind of all the stuff that's on my resume. I think what I wanted to share today is that the thing that was clear to me in every situation was that people mattered, and paying attention to the people around you mattered. So regardless of who was the smartest person in the room, teams and how those teams related mattered most to virtually any success. So I had some awful bosses and I had some great ones. I learned from both. I learned from Anderson and Huron that self-awareness was key to strong leadership. We had coaches and mentors back then, and people development was really a part of our DNA. And I have carried that with me my entire career. A short story, one of my sponsors, and we didn't call them sponsors back then, but they're very important for women's development for sure, but I think everybody's development. One of my mentors got me involved in the Boys and Girls Clubs, and it turned out to be a huge career lift. This led me to serving the Boys and Girls Clubs for about 22 years, and ultimately had the privilege of serving as their board chair. But again, it really expanded my lens from which I saw the world, and really, really important, and informed how I lead and what organizations I work with going forward. The other reason I mentioned that quick story is I was mentoring during that time another executive from another company, and recruited her to the Boys and Girls Club board. I thought it would be good for the organization. I thought it would be good for her. And that worked out. It was good for both. But as fate would have it, that executive now runs my career transition business here at BPI Group. So it's an illustration of how mentors and sponsors can help each other throughout long careers and how important that is. So today I run a company, we talked a little bit about it further, that focuses on maximizing the potential of leaders and organizations. And we work with individuals, so a little bit different than a policy focus, but it's that individual and how that individual can really develop their own potential. We've got an entire division that focuses on how organizations can better build leadership pipelines of women and people of color. And we believe that the more women, the more diverse leaders in business positions make the world a better place to be. So we do a lot of teaching on inclusive leadership. And our vision is to unlock that hidden potential in people at all levels, and to drive this courageous leadership that we need today as much as ever. And really, hopefully capitalize on this momentum to move forward faster. To touch a little bit on policies that impacted my career, we didn't really have a lot of policies back then, and there were some being talked about, but not really implemented. There was maternity leave when I started, but career-focused people weren't taking advantage of those policies because it was just, you weren't confident that that wasn't more of a negative than a positive. But my husband and I were able to have 4 kids during this time. And, you know, I guess top of my list, like Sharmili, is flexibility. So that was really the key to what made it all work. Respect for every individual that played a role in my day. And there were lots of them, and along with mentors and sponsors. And we'll talk some more about that on the panel.
Wow. Yeah. Thank you again for sharing. And I think there's a lot of overlap between both stories and how, you know, takeaways that we can pull from that. One, as employers, and what we can provide to our employees as far as engagement and growth opportunities. But I want to pull on the point, Susan, that you made on the momentum that we have today. I think coming off of a collective experience, while unique and individual, but collective in the fact that we all experienced a pandemic. And Lori, you actually alluded to this in your talking points as well, that there's this window of opportunity. And it was a theme in the conversation on Shriver. I'd love to hear from you both on what that window of opportunity means to you, and what action we should be taking as individuals, as employers, and as members of communities to make sure that we're capitalizing on that. We're moving the change forward that we need to. So Susan or Sharmili, if you'd like to dive a little bit deeper into that.
Go ahead, Susan.
I was saying, I was just talking, so maybe we could, but you know, I do see a change, and there's always that fear that there's, you know, a start and then a stop, and we've seen these ebbs and flows, certainly with women in leadership before, where, you know, when we had the war on talent in the 80s, you know, there was all sorts of money and funding to support women, and then, you know, it declined. But I do feel that it's different today. I do feel that I see people thinking and more deeply about this. That there's a couple things, and then I'll turn it over to Sharmili. But there's a couple things. I think employees have the confidence to vote with their feet, and so there are employees that don't have those options, you know, that we talked about, but many do, and many are taking it. So that is making employers wake up. And flexibility is important to people. You see it in every survey, and I hear it in every conversation with other leaders around the city. We're all trying to figure out, how do we bake in more flexibility for people at different points in their career in the workforce. It was for me, it seems to be one of the ultra important things for people. And I just noticed that it is in every conversation. How do we bring people back to the workplace? How do we keep workplace flexible? How do we keep hours flexible? And how do we continue to promote people even when they're not in front of us in an office setting? That actually, Lori Igleski was the first. She and I, when there was an ebb in the COVID, we went for a walking meeting, 6 feet apart with our masks outside, and she brought that up early. One of the first people that I heard to be thinking and talking about that as a leader. And now I think that's on everyone's to-do list, top and center. So couple things that I think are really good to keep this momentum going.
Yeah, that's great. I know, Lori, when we were chatting ahead of the event too, that's something that you called out is at Fifth Third, taking everyone's unique circumstances into account and how we return to the office was important, but also keeping a lens to equity and the fact that we've got a lot of folks in the office all throughout the pandemic serving our clients at the branches. So the flexibility, there's a lot of opportunity, I think, to carry that forward and have inclusivity as a result to that. So thanks for calling that out, Susan.
Yeah, we talk about that as meeting everybody where they are, and it transcended age, it transcended station in terms of where they are in their career. Many people moved. We have people that do not live in Chicago anymore that work for the bank that are very valuable employees. And how can they continue to have, an important role at the company and not necessarily be diminished by that and lose out on opportunity?
I love what you described, Lori, as meeting people where they are. I think particularly when you're talking about the advancement of women in the workplace, you simply can't ignore the caregiving responsibilities that largely fall on women. Certainly not exclusively, but definitely predominantly. And those caregiving responsibilities are even more pronounced for single moms and for women in households where they're the primary breadwinners. Which is often like Black and Latinx households where caregiving is that. And so that flexibility has a direct relationship, I think, to the realities of taking care of children, taking care of parents or other members of your family who are relying on you and who have needs that often coincide with what we consider a traditional workday as well. And so understanding that, I think, is really, really important. For our work, I think the window of opportunity that you were speaking of, Jessica, is also window is actually such a great metaphor for this, because windows are also about being able to see something, right? Mm. And there's a way in which we have been able to see a lot of what has been invisible to us before, or just has been made more clear, right? A lot of what we're talking about right now are the circumstances of professional women. But flexibility means something very different when you're doing low-wage work. Work from home is not possible when you're working in service industries like the grocery store or restaurants and that kind of thing. And I think there's a way in which this whole concept of essential work is something that many of us did not think about, or at least think about or see as clearly as we have during and in the wake of this current phase of the pandemic. So I think one of the windows of opportunity for us is to not close the blinds on what it is that we have seen and what we have been exposed to, and the ways in which so many of us are really reliant on a lot of what that invisible labor, essential work is. And so what do we do that really affirms and supports the dignity and value of the work that that essential workers and the folks who were being discussed in the Shriver event, the domestic workers and the other folks who make it possible for us to do the work that we do?
Sharmili, thanks for calling that out. I'm curious if you've got thoughts around what action we should be taking to affirm those workers and to keep the blinds open. Are there any specific steps that we should as individuals be taking or as employers be taking to support those efforts and keeping that window open and capitalizing on that?
Definitely, as an advocacy organization, we're always pushing forward policies that we believe make it more possible for people to bring their best selves to work and to participate fully in the economy and opportunity that there is to offer in our city and our communities. A few of the things that we really are looking at right now are things I've already mentioned: paid sick leave, and my colleague Mary Kay put something in the chat for understanding a little bit better what paid sick leave means, particularly during a public health crisis. I think we can definitely see why paid sick leave would be necessary, and yet we have well over 1 million Illinoisans who don't have access to any paid sick leave. So really believe that that's something to change. And within the public health context, it matters to all of us whether other people have paid sick leave, right? It's not just about whether we have it and whether we're able to take paid sick leave when we're in need of taking care of ourselves or other members of our household. But I want to make sure that the folks who I am buying groceries from, or who I'm getting my lunch or my coffee from, that they also have access to paid sick leave, and they're not placed in this impossible position of making choices between, do I go to work sick or do I risk losing a paycheck or a job, right? So I think that that's of value to all of us. We've also seen in a lot of the COVID relief legislation, the first round of COVID relief legislation had paid leave, so paid family and medical leave as important pieces to that. Now, part of that was connected to the fact that childcare centers were closed, schools were remote. Like there were many circumstances that really required that we were there for our families. But moving forward, it's time. Families in the United States lose over $22 billion a year because of a lack of paid leave. We are one of only 2 countries with no form of national paid leave. We invest less in childcare than almost all other developed countries. Like, we're really low on the list. And 80% of people in America don't have access to paid family leave. I mean, it doesn't match up with kind of who we are as a country and what our position is in the world for us to continue to put families in this position of not being able to support themselves and take care of who they need to. You know, the other things we are concerned about, of course, are addressing student debt. We know student debt is a huge issue. I know, of course, Fifth Third is very well aware of the impact of student debt, and it's a differential impact. That women hold about 2/3 of all student debt. And when you factor race in, it takes a lot longer for Black and Brown households to pay back student debt. So that's another thing that I think has really been illuminated, right, during this crisis as well. There are so many opportunities we have in front of us to take what we've learned during the pandemic, to take what we've seen and really build institutions and infrastructure, policies, practice, culture that moves us forward. Because returning to the status quo is returning to a situation that really wasn't working for most people. And that momentum that Susan's talking about, that she's seeing, the ways in which employers are thinking differently, what Lori's talking about at Fifth Third in terms of meeting people where they're at, you know, that is what we want to continue to move forward and not just have be a reactive moment, but rather a transformation.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that makes this window interesting is perhaps something that Susan mentioned earlier is us revisiting this war on talent and, you know, the votes of employees, you know, from, you know, marching out. And I think we've got a great opportunity as corporations and employers to take advantage of this moment to advance these policies and to hold ourselves accountable. And I'm proud of Fifth Third and the efforts that have been done well ahead of the pandemic to advance a lot of the policies that you're referencing, Sharmili. But I'm curious if Susan, or if you've got thoughts on this as well, but in referencing the most recent Edelman Trust survey and how you know, corporations are deemed the most trustworthy relative to government and media and other agencies and organizations. So, you know, what that means is how our leadership teams as corporations are guiding social movement for employees and for our clients, et cetera. So, Susan, you absolutely honed in on flexibility and the importance of that. Is there anything else that either you, Susan, or Sharmili think that employers, the steps that they should be taking in this moment?
You know, I think there's a whole lot there. There's a whole lot there, right? And I think what's part of what's pushing the momentum forward through corporations is that corporations were forced to, and it's people, right? It's people like all of us in our organizations, were forced to take a look at how things can be done differently, right? And in any kind of change that you're trying to enact, you know, it's never irrational. I mean, we all know that businesses perform better with diverse populations, right? Diverse thinking, diverse experiences, diverse voices at the table, right? So we've all been trying to amplify those voices. We need to continue to do that. However, change is hard. And so the pandemic forced everybody to think about things very, very differently and say, okay, we've got to look at things differently, and we should and will. One thing that we do not have right is women in childbearing years. We just have to do something to support. I mean, they are the only people that can have these babies. And so, you know, we cannot lose them out of the workforce. We cannot lose their thinking, their value, their uniqueness, right? Their brilliance. And so we have to figure out that period of time and what organizations can do. And I don't know that we're there yet. I don't know that it's extended parental leave. I mean, that's part of it, but there really has to be more. What we advocate for, a little self-serving, is coaches, right? We think that people cannot do this alone. And what we think is a real help and success, what we've seen, not even pandemic related, but an ability to bring diverse, underrepresented people through organizations involves kind of 4 constructs, and that's stretch roles for individuals, but support of that individual, and then cohorts, teams of people around them that are all trying to progress, learn, grow, as well as sponsors within organizations that are trained how to sponsor people different than them. And then that helps create that culture and that environment, and just very purposefully looking at that. And now we can do that all with this new lens of almost anything's possible. Let's figure it out. And so I don't know if I specifically answered your question, but I think the attention of corporations and the realization that these are all people that make up these organizations, and that the people, the care and well-being of the people is so critical. And to Sharmilia's point, their support networks that help them get into the office every day, all those things are part of sort of our supply chain, if you will, that makes our companies work and grow and build. So if we can continue to shine a spotlight on that, and I don't think there's one size fits all.
I think what I appreciate about that, Susan, also is like, it takes intention.
Yeah.
Like, it's not accidental. It takes intention. It takes real listening. So I think the level of purposeful employee engagement is really, really critical for employers to have. And that just increases when you have folks who are working remotely as well as in the office, or, some mix of that. You really need to be able to hearing what people are experiencing, what are their pain points, what can you offer to help resolve some of those pain points. I know some companies are offering like childcare allowances, for example, because they really understand how critical the care infrastructure is to making sure that people are able to get to work. And to be able to bring themselves, the folks that Susan's talking about, people in their childbearing years, right? How do you support that infrastructure, that the supports that they need to be able to do that as well? I think that's really something that employers can do that's really important.
Sharmili, I thought what you mentioned earlier too, and childcare being this item that we had clarity through the window in this moment, was really relatable for me. Having, an 8-year-old, a 6-year-old, and a 4-year-old, we were in the midst of it during the pandemic. So it's interesting to think through the policy that can change from a government standpoint, but also how corporations can support employees during those stages of caretaking, which could be childcare, but also elderly care, depending upon the circumstances. And something that, I was proud to see our institution do during the pandemic was issue an allowance for emergency care. And that's something that was new, but it paired with a policy that we had, or benefit that we had rather, well ahead of the pandemic, which included a maternity concierge that helped navigate a lot of those challenges for employees, across the organization. But I just wanted to call that out because I think, in all of the conversations that we've probably been a part of on this coin term with the SHE session, childcare is driving perhaps a large amount of the workforce exodus as it relates to the composition of women in that. So thank you for calling that out.
And just
please,
before we move on, I just want to put a little exclamation point on that. Our company was astounded how seamlessly we moved our workforce to completely remote, As a bank, we executed these PPP loans for thousands of companies while people like Jessica ran school all day long for their children. So when you talk about what we can do at work, the innovation that Susie is talking about, it is so exciting to think about what is possible. And we have to absolutely seize on these opportunities right now before the luster and the good feelings of what we've accomplished has worn off, so that we can show Jamie Dimon that it isn't, the people that hustle don't all have to be in the office all the time. So that's what I have to say.
Oh, that's really true. That's really true. And the other thing is, you know, I made it work, Lori, you made it work, right? Our generation who are now in position to make some of these decisions also don't have all the answers or all the brilliant ideas. We have some brilliant ideas, but not all of them, right? And so what is really important, I think, is for people to have confidence in their own voice. And your solution isn't going to be maybe the solution for the entire organization or entire division, but it is going to be a solution, right? And so to the extent that we can encourage women to speak up and to think about, what does the company need and what do I need to give the company what they need? I mean, the company is typically writing the paycheck, right? There's this connection that really matters and is really helpful. So a lot of the writing and a lot of the stuff in the narrative today is more on the complaint. You know, CEOs need to speak out on social issues, need to make a statement about, you know, something for the entire organization. Some of that is right, and we're moving in the right direction. However, it's also really, really hard from a corporate perspective. So the more we can hear individual voices, the more we can amplify those individual voices and put them together in a way that really drives the innovation and solutioning of some of this, I think is really important.
And Susan, one of the questions that we got in the chat, I think relates to that in part. The question's a bit specific, but how do you recommend folks pursue sponsors internally? And the reason why I brought that up is amplifying that voice. I think sponsors are essential to facilitating that change. So if you've got any tips there, and Sharmili, feel free to chime in as well.
Yeah, that's a tricky thing. We've seen a lot of people just walk up and knock on the door and say, "Hey, Lori, will you sponsor me?" You know, and maybe you've never met, and it's hard, and everybody wants sometimes the same people who seem approachable and successful, and then that makes for, you know, obviously a great match. But I think what I would advise is people to think about, what do I want to do? Where do I want to go? What do I need to know about that path, about those skills that I need to build to get to the next step, and then 2 or 3 steps beyond that. And then think about people who have done that before. And so then when you approach a person to ask them to sponsor you, and let me break a minute to say the difference between a mentor and a sponsor. And a sponsor is really somebody who has a power base and will spend some of that political capital on your behalf. So it's a little bit different from a mentor. We need both, right? You need people to talk to and get ideas from and bounce ideas off of. But that sponsor is really a person willing to spend some of their political capital to help you advance. Which is important for visibility, especially in large organizations for sure. But so then when you go to someone to ask to be your sponsor, you can state specifically, here's what the organization has asked me to do. Here's where I think I play well and can do. Here's what I need to learn. Can you help me do that? You know, so it's a little bit more of a directed path versus just broadly, can you sponsor me? Hope that's helpful.
Absolutely.
Maybe somebody else has other ideas too on the call.
Well, I think what you're also talking about there, Susan, is building a relationship, right? It's not just a cold ask. It's helping to create that connection and help someone understand like why you're asking them, and what you see as possible synergies between your paths.
Absolutely, yeah.
Well, if you have more questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. But while we await for that, I do want to make sure that we're capturing any key takeaways that the panelists want to bring to the audience. So Sharmili, if you'd like, if there are action steps that we should be taking or some key talking points, I want to make sure that we're closing with those front and center as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the issue of the pandemic is one that's active. So I think it's important to realize that the pandemic is not over. And while we're at a different phase for sure, we haven't seen the end of it yet. And so essential workers, folks on the front lines, they continue to be shouldering significant risk. And what we've seen with COVID, for example, is that the highest rate of fatalities in terms of like workplaces was among those who worked in food and agriculture, which we all rely on, right? It's line cooks, it's migrant workers in the farms, and that there's trauma associated with all of that, right? This was a very, for some people, a more traumatic experience, has been a more traumatic experience than for others. So I think that goodwill, the luster that Lori was speaking of, I think it's incumbent on us to continue to approach other folks who we rely on, particularly those who we rely on, with a level of empathy and generosity that many of us have already shown. And I think we just encourage you to continue to show it, right? So one of the things I'd like to highlight is just that folks who've worked in restaurants in particular, who are actually paid a sub-minimum wage and rely on tips in order to actually make their wages, they've experienced really significant dives in tips and increases in harassment, really bad behavior on the part of customers in particular. And so I know that many of us were tipping very like extra generously, particularly in the earlier months of the pandemic. And I would certainly encourage us to continue to do that, because it is actually still a very, very necessary thing. We can each, we have a sphere of influence. You don't have to be a CEO to have a sphere of influence. And so many of us rely on domestic workers, right? So nannies, people who come into our homes to clean, those kinds of things, maybe help take care of family members, and making sure that we are, we're treating them with dignity and that we're actually complying with the law. So Chicago actually just passed some new ordinances that require the domestic workers are paid $15 an hour as of August 1st of this year, and that they get a written contract in their language that includes what is expected of them, so that it provides a little bit more equal footing, right, for folks. So I think it's complying with those laws. But again, remembering these are folks who care for those most precious to us. Like, they should be treated accordingly, in accordance with what we heard from iGen during the Shriver event. I see Lori's question, and I'm going to try and respond to that really quickly as well. People are not working because they're getting employment or enhanced unemployment. I think so that is, it's factually untrue. So first of all, so one thing I want to point out is that regular unemployment insurance is a benefit we are all entitled to. We pay into that. It is our money that we are taking out when we pull out regular unemployment insurance. The enhanced benefits are very limited, particularly when it comes to thinking about like a single parent and having children. We have not resolved the childcare issue. So for a lot of folks, especially considering what childcare costs are in this country, even if you have access to childcare, its affordability is such an issue that it does not make financial sense for some people to have to deal with the increased costs related to childcare, the possibility of having to take care of your children remotely, for when we were in school. There's just so many different factors. I think it's just problematic to essentially characterize people as not willing to work, when what we've found is when you provide jobs that have quality, that provide safety, that have the wages and benefits that they should, that you can attract workers when you do that. The other thing is that a lot of these unemployment benefits are going to expire, the special ones, right? So we're not talking about like a permanent solution, and yet the childcare piece has not been addressed. So I think we're running up against a number of issues, and the people who provide service to us are doing their jobs, and they deserve to be treated with humanity and dignity. And whether or not they're dealing with supply chain issues, which are resulting in you having to wait a little bit longer for your crab rangoon, or whether they're covering more tables and dealing with more restrictions, I think this is a moment for us to continue empathy and generosity. And unemployment insurance and unemployment benefits are not the issue. I think it's how we treat people that is the issue.
Thank you for saying that. And we can all help our fellow women and lower wage workers and helping to change that narrative.
Thanks for asking that, Lori.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it seems that we're clear in the chat. So while, feel free to add a question if you'd like, but while we're at this moment, I do want to make sure that I'm calling out again that this conversation that we're having today is a result of Shriver Center's content, and really excited that we're able to carry the conversation forward, and would again encourage all of the audience members and anyone who's viewing this webinar at a later date to check back in with the Shriver Center content. It is a second session of a 3-part series for the Road to Recovery, with a final webinar coming up later this year, focused on the real change for communities of color. So just like we had this debrief today, you'll expect another debrief hosted by Fifth Third to again amplify the voice of Shriver Center, bring us in alignment on actionable steps that we can be taking to facilitate change. So I can't thank our panelists enough for your time, for the conversation, for helping us move forward with momentum to ensure that the blinds stay open. Sharmili, I love that. And if anyone has closing thoughts or anything that you want to bring to the audience, please feel free to take this moment to do so.
I would love to just amplify what Sharmili said, is keep the blinds open and hold up, I guess the way I look at it is hold up a mirror to the other women in your world and show them their strength, show them what they contribute, and give them that energy to keep going and keep fighting the good fight. And also, when you're sitting at a table at a restaurant waiting for your food and you're not happy with the slow service, I think reframe your thinking, like we've been talking about, innovate, think again, and say, no, I'm sitting here and they're serving me. I don't have to cook. Add a little extra tip, because it's probably a super rough day for those folks doing that service. And you can, replicate that to many other service industries. But thank you. Thank you for being interested in the conversation.
Thank you. Yes, I'd echo Susan's comments, empathy and generosity. And Lori, you brought up a great point, again, amplified by Susan, women helping women. That's what that's what I think gathers us today in a lot of ways, and really important issues that we should all be taking stake in progressing. So thank you so much for that. And Lori, thank you for your leadership. Thank you for joining in the conversation.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
Sharmili, thank you.
From Fifth Third.
Thank you. Thank you all. I've learned so much, and I really appreciate the ways in which you've shared Fifth Third kind of being an example, and so grateful to be part of this conversation.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Great job, Jessica. Thank you so much. Wonderful moderator.
Thanks, everyone.